Elizabeth Warren is out with a new piece of legislation that would mandate that the Pentagon take climate change into account as it plans for the future. She's getting some flack for this proposal, partly for the way that it was framed, in the sense that she said if the military is going to carry out its mission, it must take climate change into account. And people have said, I think, somewhat fairly, what do you mean carry out the mission? You think that the most important thing to do when fighting climate change is to make sure that the American empire can continue to dominate around the globe? We need global solidarity. We don't need the U.S. military out on counterproductive missions. Aside from that framing, which I think was one piece of one tweet from Warren, there's a lot to be said for the idea that the Pentagon has a huge role to play when it comes to combating climate change and implementing a Green New Deal. And I actually spoke with Brianna Gunn Wright about this topic on Monday evening. This was before Warren put out her idea, and I put to her the question of what the role of the Pentagon could be in combating climate change, because if there's a divided government, if the Republicans can still control the Senate, the president is commander-in-chief and controls this $800 billion annual budget. Here's what Gunn Wright, who was kind of not the architect necessarily of the Green New Deal, but somebody who had a lot of say and is a widely respected policymaker behind the Green New Deal.
The military has talked about climate change as a national security issue, actually far before I think folks in the federal government moved, and have continually talked about it as a national security issue. And so I think you could do a lot to not necessarily not commandeer that budget, but I think you might want to use some of it. But there's a question like DARPA has a lot of experience popularizing, investing in and then commercializing technology. So could DARPA do things around energy? We have ARPA-E, but it doesn't have that much funding, and they don't have as much experience with commercialization. So how do you use DARPA? Are there ways to sort of deploy folks on climate-related missions, right? Particularly in countries like Mozambique that have been harmed by our emissions, but are low, producers themselves, right? So I think that's part of it. The Navy's already planning how to shift away to move bases, right? Are there ways to tie that into a Green New Deal? Is there ways to tie in that movement and that funding that they're planning with a Green New Deal, right? To make those centers of jobs and renewables and clean energy.
Related to what Gunn Wright is saying is something that author Christian Parenti has talked about, which is called the Big Green Buy. What it says that, the U.S. gross domestic product is somewhere in the neighborhood of $14 trillion a year. The federal budget is somewhere in the neighborhood of $4 to $5 trillion a year. That means that if you want to create demand for green power and for green products, if you mandated that the government buy green top to bottom, it would catalyze a lot of private investment into green technology. If the government said, you know what, we're only going to do electric vehicles for the post office, or the military is going to go completely carbon neutral or net zero in the next 20 years, it would produce the demand that would then have a private sector come in and say, okay, well, instead of pumping our research and development into the latest jet fighter, the rocket-fueled jet fighter, we're going to try to come up with ways to conserve energy here, to use solar power remotely there, and that's just a start. If you sit down and pencil around with this roughly $800 billion budget, which is probably the single largest carbon producing entity on the planet, the opportunities to create something different are extraordinary. Now, I think Warren also got criticized, and perhaps fairly, for not saying, look, the footprint is the problem. The giant Pentagon carbon footprint, which, yes, it's better to turn that into carbon neutral, but in the meantime, let's just roll it back. Why are we spending $800 billion a year on Pentagon rather than 10% of that?